In the last module, we learned about individual differences and assessment. Those are both important parts of the staffing process, which is actually a group of processes that lead to decisions about whether someone should be hired or fired. Common sense probably makes it pretty easy to name at least one reason that process is important, because it influences how well a job gets done, and therefore a number of other things in the organization. One of the metaphors I use to think about in staffing is a jigsaw puzzle. The goal of the process is to find the person who's the best fit, sort of like finding where each piece fits in a puzzle. So staffing is about deciding who goes where. It includes a number of decisions that start before a potential applicant makes contact with the organization and can continue throughout the individual's time at the organization. You might have noticed I did not include promotion when I mentioned the outcomes of staffing decisions in the first slide, though it is a staffing decision. In many cases, the job to which a person would be promoted is very different than the one they might have because of the nature of the organizational structure. For example, a salesperson might be promoted to sales manager. The job of a manager requires different characteristics than that of a salesperson, though, so someone who excels in sales might not do well as a manager. Given that, I think it's important to treat promotions the same as hiring decisions for any other job, perhaps just using different recruitment methods. Thinking about staffing in the context of the larger organization adds some context for those thoughts about promotion. Our book talks about strategic perspectives and models for staffing, which is a fancy way of saying the process needs to fit with the organization's goals and how the job in question influences those goals. In some cases, that will mean that the job is well-defined and relatively unlikely to change, so the goal is to find the right person for the job. In other cases, the exact tasks are harder to identify, but it's clear what the employee needs to accomplish, so the goal of the staffing decision is to find someone who can accomplish what needs to be done. In other cases, it's not especially clear what needs to be accomplished, and the goal of staffing is to find someone who can help figure it out. Part of the idea is that we'll need to use a different approach to assessing and selecting employees in each of those scenarios. The characteristics of a successful employee will vary. This idea also helps us realize that it might not be productive to use the same process for every job in an organization. That said, the steps in the process will be similar. The figure in this slide duplicates the comprehensive staffing model discussed in the text. The graphic's a little different because it flows from top down. That said, notice we start with identifying applicants and then move into different forms of assessment. We'll learn about job analysis, which informs assessments, in the next module. I thought it would be helpful to have this context before we move into that process. Ideally, staffing is a process. In other words, it reflects a plan and intentional decision-making. That process will begin with recruiting internal or external candidates, but not all applicants will be considered at every phase in the process. The decisions will be based on reliable and valid information about the job and the candidates that allows for accurate predictions about each candidate's success. At this point, you might be thinking, seems like a lot of work. Is it really worth it? You might have even been able to think of situations where the process was far from this ideal and resulted in someone getting a job where they performed well for years. If I wanted to be glib, I would say something along the lines of, even a broken clock's right twice a day, but that analogy is pretty outdated. Interestingly, most of the clocks I have just go dark if they're broken. But I digress. There are definitely going to be exceptions, and there might be situations where the cost of an ideal process is more than the cost of making a bad staffing decision. But I have a hard time thinking of many jobs where bad staffing decisions don't come at a cost. So maybe we would at least make the case that it's worth it to use some formal processes, even if they don't fit that ideal model. And there are definitely some jobs that are worth going to the trouble of the ideal model. I've seen a wide range of estimates for the cost of turnover, but the most modest is $15,000. In other words, there are jobs where it is probably worth it to use the ideal process. Given that, it makes sense to look at what our textbook refers to as high-performance practices. Another way to say the practices that are supported by research, like the use of job analysis and formal assessments, just to name a few. Another reason it's worth the cost of thinking about the process is because of the stakeholders. From managers to subordinates, coworkers to customers, there can be a lot of people impacted by staffing decisions. We've mentioned what staffing is and why we should care about the process. Another consideration is how to make those decisions. Yes, we need to make decisions about how to make decisions, as tedious as it might seem. One choice in the staffing process is whether to use what we call statistical decision-making or what we call clinical decision-making. In other words, whether to use a statistical formula or whether to have a person look at the results of the assessments and weigh the options. As you can imagine, they each have strengths and weaknesses, one of which relates to their efficiency. Applying a statistical model can be much quicker than having someone look at all the candidates. The efficiency of statistical decision-making increases when it's used as part of a hurdle system. In other words, a system where a candidate is no longer considered for the job if they don't have a particular score or scores. That approach is called non-compensatory because a high score in one area can't balance out a low score in another area. Like I said, it's efficient, but if the system isn't deliberately designed, it might not result in the best candidates clearing the hurdle. For example, I've seen a few articles recently about using a certain number of years' experience as a hurdle early in the process, and about how that can actually be a bad practice. Years of experience might mean the candidate's familiar with the job, but that familiarity might not create any advantage. If the organizations are very different or there's a need for innovation, it can actually lead to worse performance compared to someone who's just learning about the job. So maybe the hurdle needs to be refined to experience in the industry, or defined in terms of individual difference characteristics that's more relevant for successful performance. Another option is to use a compensatory system like a regression equation. The idea of a compensatory system is that a strong score on one variable can balance out a lower score on another variable. For example, if my score on a relevant personality characteristic was fairly high, I wouldn't be disqualified for a lower score on a knowledge characteristic. So far, I've been talking about the ideas as they apply to hiring employees, but staffing also includes decisions about employees leaving the organization. In the cases of layoffs or downsizing, some of the same ideas used for hiring are important. Often those situations require comparing employees to make a decision. In other cases, there's cause for terminating individual employees. While the decision-making criteria are different in those situations, it's still important to have established and deliberate processes. Altogether then, 5 main themes that emerge when we try to understand the staffing process. One is that it's about whether an individual fits. Second is about what we're asking if they fit in a particular organization. Third and fourth themes are the process and return on investment in that process, so to speak. The fifth theme is the decisions about decisions.